pardon me, sorry, it's commonly referred to as chronic fatigue syndrome in the United States, which is challenging because that's a very, well, it's kind of a misnomer in a lot of ways. So for me to be diagnosed with ME, which is similar actually to what they're thinking long COVID is. So if you've been hearing about long haulers or long COVID, you have some idea of what people with ME are facing. So for me, being a higher fat or infinite fat, or as I lovingly call myself, death fats, thanks to Leslie Kinzel for that lovely term. Everything that was happening for me with the ME is seen as a failure of fatness, right? So when I'm having muscle weakness, when I'm having extreme fatigue, when I am having other like issues with like racing heartbeat or issues connected with POTS, all of that was attributed to, well, you're fat and therefore you're just deconditioned. All you need to do is eat less, exercise more, you will recover. And that is just bananas, considering the disease is more about inflammation in the brain and the spinal cord. So when I was trying to get diagnosed, many people take up to 15 years to get a diagnosis. Mine took just under 12. So I spent years doing things like Overeaters Anonymous and special diets and gluten-free and trying to exercise. And those recommendations, because of the way they saw my body, actually made my disease more progressive to the point where I'm mostly housebound at this point. I only leave for a doctor's appointment because they kept telling me, exercise, eat less, exercise. And that is exactly what you would do to escalate that disease. And there, I'm sorry, was there a second part to that question?
Not so much. Well, I guess in terms of, that sounds a lot medical and disability related as well, but do you have any thoughts on disability side of things, if you want to differentiate in any way?
Oh, okay. So in the disabled side of things, why I took on the label of disabled, it really started when I started to use my walker, because I, as a fat person, am already quite visible. And when I started to use a walker, that also makes me extra visible in some ways, because I'm no longer the good fat person that can, trek around without assistance and, can look as if I am very healthy. So when I started using my walker, I had so much shame, and I would have people that would, literally just like 3 months ago, I was in a grocery store and a person stopped me and told me that I need to not rely on my walker or I'm going to end up in a wheelchair someday, because I'll get used to having this assistance and I won't push myself to recover, basically. And I was like, man, I'm just trying to buy cheese. Like, I don't know. But before I accepted the label of disability, that would just like destroy my world. But when I started using disabled and understanding the politics that go into that, as far as like a car is a mobility aid, a roller skates are a mobility aid, clothing are a adaptive aid because our bodies don't naturally want to be uncovered in 30-degree weather. And when I started learning those things, I was able to access resources that I wouldn't have known how to access without taking on that label. So I was able to talk to people more because I felt like instead of being an imposter in a community and taking away resources, I was like, no, the way that something is affecting me is disabling. And it's really hard to be able to use Google or something and not use the label and still be able to find the resources and connect with the people that are going to provide community information, and kind of help me on that journey of, it's not a bad word, I'm not a bad person, like this just, it just is.
Yeah, definitely. And did you have a similar kind of journey or find a similar kind of community related to the fat term?
I absolutely did. Wow. You get much different resources when you start using terms that are associated with fat liberation, body acceptance. And I found a big crossover between fat liberation and the disabled movement as far as helping people to understand that what you see for me on the surface is not something that you can look at and justify like, she is fat, therefore she deserves whatever is happening to her. So that was a big difference when I would go to a doctor's office and they would bring up, oh, your weight. And I would say, I am aware I am fat. This is not a disease that only fat people get. And it seemed when they would hear the not cushioning the language, it kind of like, I don't know, it's like when you blow in a baby's face and they're like, ugh. It's kind of like that with the doctors and I'm not deferring anymore. I'm saying, yes, I am fat. This is a neutral descriptor for the body that I live in. And it takes out that power from them to be able to like name and blame, like, oh, you need to lose weight. I'm like, no. And I have the resources now to back it up and say, I have science, I have experience. You need to move past this if you're going to treat me.
Yeah. Do you have any more you'd like to say related to the medical treatment, the medical side of things, being both fat and disabled? If I recall, you had a story you wanted to tell.
I have two. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize the level of discrimination or even pushback that fat people receive when going to medical providers. So one of the things that I often tell people is bring a witness. I think it's terrible, but I always have to bring my husband or my partner with me. And that way I find people treat me better and more human than if I am alone. So for example, I had found a tumor on my thyroid And my doctor sent me to an endocrinologist, which is an appropriate thing. And my husband was working, so I didn't have anybody to go with me. And I went into the doctor's office, and I have other issues that absolutely, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, other endocrinology issues like PCOS that really should have been addressed. And when I went to this doctor, I had just started in recovery for anorexic eating disorder. And at that time, I had just stopped eating a very, very low calorie diet. And when she brought up the fact of my weight, because of the thyroid tumor, my weight had been rising very quickly. And the doctor that I had been seeing had noted that and was like, that shouldn't be happening at that accelerated rate. And the endocrinologist, who's supposed to be a specialist, where I'm like, I'm stressed, I'm upset, there's things growing on me that shouldn't be growing. And she told me that the reason that I was gaining weight was because I was eating more than 900 calories a day, and that someone like me should never have more than that or they're going to gain weight, and completely ignored everything else. No, didn't discuss anything about the thyroid issues or anything, so much as just to tell me it was my fault because I was eating too much. And when I got in the car, and I had about a 30-minute drive home, and I just rage cried, like where you're so mad, but the only thing that comes out is tears. And I was just so frustrated and defeated. And that was very much before I had started coming into the identity labels of fatness. And I didn't know how to put into perspective that what I had experienced was anti-fat bias and hatred in a lot of ways. Because that nutritionist that I saw for the eating disorder recovery was the first person to introduce me to the concept of, at that time, health at every size. And then I started moving into the fat liberation community. So that doctor was one of the first doctors that was so aggressively like anti-fat that after that feeling of just rage and helplessness, when I started getting those terms and talking to other people, it's where I found the blog that we'll link shortly, which is the First Do No Harm blog, which I'm sorry, I don't remember who started the blog, but they decided to collect people's stories of fat discrimination when they went to the doctor. And I never would have known that that resource existed had I not got into the fat liberation communities. So after that feeling of just helplessness and rage, and then finding out that there is thousands and thousands of stories of people that have had the same things happen, people who have had cancer diagnosis dismissed, people who have had strokes that were dismissed, people who've had blood clots that were dismissed, and people who have even had, benign ear infection things that were dismissed. It finally gave me a sense of empowerment when I went to the doctor and I was like, you're not going to dismiss me. And if they did, I would go somewhere else instead of going home, curling in on myself and feeling like what I really need to do is just get strict with my food and, make sure that they can't dismiss me anymore.
Yeah, it's powerful experience, and we will put the link to that momentarily. Do you have anything else you want to say about the um, the disability community in the way that you found the fat liberation community and the disability community? Anything else you want to say on that side?
I'm sorry, could you clarify that?
Yeah, sorry. It may also be a repetitive question. Just in terms of, thank you, Andrea, for putting that in the chat. The sense of community that you described in finding these stories around fatness, is there a similar sense of community from identifying as disabled?
Definitely. So one of the things that is difficult for me in my experience of fatness is feeling like I am taking things that I mean, the word gluttony is usually what comes to mind, right? That I am taking something that other people deserve. And when I came into the community for disability, I really started to get the sense that I'm not actually like a drain on the resources so much as a welcome part of a community that sees my involvement as a building of strength, that there are things that I can bring when I bring my knowledge about fatness, about fat liberation, and I bring that in. And, you know, even if people are not fat and disabled, they need to know the ways that anti-fat attitudes impact their ability to get care as a disabled person. Because in the same way we know that, you know, like masculinity, the way that that can be harmful to men or male identified people, we know that anti-fat attitudes are also used to keep thin or small fat people kind of in line, because you don't want to lose your privilege and your access to be treated better in society. And so when I came into the disabled community, I was like, oh, I don't, you know, I felt like I might be taking something away from someone else. And it's where I really learned that it's not a zero-sum game, that having more people is actually like a stronger base for all of us. And I found that other folks wanted to learn how that they could embrace that identity as well, because we really do. I mean, we really want to exist in community. We don't want to feel like we're alone, or that people don't experience what I experience, right? Like, I often tell people, I'm like, I am so glad you can relate. I am so sorry you can relate. Like, I wouldn't want anybody else to go through this, but I am really, really glad to find out that I am not the only one going through this. And had I not found a descriptive words for that type of community, I wouldn't have been able to be embraced or feel that sense of belonging that has helped me to continue to function in a society that continually says you don't belong, you're not doing it right, you're not valued. And having people that are like, oh, nah, that's no, you're valued, come be with us, you know. And that's very much what I have found in the different disability communities that I have been part of. I have not met any resistance of people like, no, we don't want you here, you know. It's more of like, join us, we have cookies.
I like that especially. You hear that come to the dark side, we have cookies, but come to the fat liberation movement. We have cookies. I love that.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, it I've heard a lot of people talk about like reclamation of words, of reclaiming things that used to be slurs so that they don't have the same power over you. And I think that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier about telling the doctors and using the term fat instead of obesity or overweight and things like that. No, I'm going to take this word, I'm going to use it in a way that is descriptive, but non-judgmental and not a pejorative. And as I've done that, I have seen within my own group of people, when I first started, people would go, "Oh, no, you're not fat." And I'm like, no, yeah, I'm fat. It's okay. It's okay. And now, I'm finding some of my community where I'm seeing it branch out to where they're like, I have met this friend and gosh, they seem really kind of wrapped up in some of the mainstream stuff. And I started telling them about what you told me. And I was like, yes, like recruit them all, come, but it's amazing to see when not only the way that I have been influenced by people within the fat community, within the disabled community, but to see it also sort of filter out and like subtly influence my friends and family who are not super active in the uh, identity side and the political side and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great when you see that kind of ripple effect. Um, at this time, I would love to open it up for other people's questions. I have a couple more if we don't get a whole lot, but wanted to see if anyone else has questions or thoughts or comments, anything like that they want to toss in the ring.
I'll go ahead and, oh, Kat, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
Well, maybe for this part, I'll stop the share so we can look at each other. Does that sound good? My first question to you was how, I'm trying to phrase this in the correct way, how, are there any resources you found or anything particularly useful you found in trying to detach the feeling and stigma of the word fat? Because that's kind of where I'm at with my like personal journey. And I see why I have so many messed up feelings about it, because when I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, everybody in my life since I was born was like using this word and putting all these connotations on it. And yeah, I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you so much for asking. So one of the things that I have found particularly important was that I started out more in body positivity and just kind of like what they would term fat acceptance. And I found some success with that in the mainstream, but I think in some ways they kind of, what's the word for it, like defanged it to where it's more about personal responsibility and having positive feelings. The resources that I started to find that I found most helpful came from the label fat liberation or body liberation. And in that regard, it becomes much more intersectional in that we're no longer talking about a personal experience so much as we're looking at systemic ways in which anti-fat attitudes and medical bias influence the entire culture that we're experiencing. So what I hear in your question is kind of like, I know that I should, like, it's not a should, it's like, I know that there's other information out there but it's hard to start to change those feelings when you're like marinating in a system of consistently anti-fat and anti-disabled information, right? It's not what we see culturally. It's not what we see in media. And even as a, higher fat disabled person, there's absolutely times where I find myself having internalized ableism or internalized fat attitudes. And it was finding the term of liberation to go along with that. So body liberation, fat liberation, to where I started to understand it's not so much a personal responsibility to moderate every thought and feeling you have, but to start to understand the ways in which the entire culture that we're living in influences that dialogue that goes through our heads on a daily basis. So, when I have other people come up to me and they're like, I really like fundamentally on the inside as a person, I believe this, but I find myself having these thoughts and I find this being my knee-jerk reaction. And a very helpful therapist had told me quite often that the first thought you have is what you are culturally conditioned to have. The second thought you have is kind of more where you're going as a person. So I think that it's important to expose yourself to as much diversity and content and experience as possible to counteract that little soup of oppression that we're all marinating in, but also to have a little bit of grace for yourself that even if you're having these internalized responses, or you find yourself saying something to someone, that it's okay to have that second reaction and to say, okay, that's not where I want to be. This is where I would like to be. And how can I work with the communities that are attached to that to start making that more of a reality for all of us?
Thank you for that. And I feel like this question kind of follows up with that because I do hear you making a distinction between like the Haze movement and body liberation. So from someone who's on the outside, is there a difference? Is it like a spectrum? What do you think?
Oh, that's a big question. I think honestly, there's probably people writing their PhD dissertations on that question. So excellent point. I think the movement, like originally, I think the people that were bringing Haze to the forefront, who were bringing fat acceptance to the forefront, a lot of that got, as I said, like they just stripped the power from it by commercializing it and integrating it into capitalism for the most part. I mean, that's really what happened. So a lot like, Haze and fat acceptance started in Black women's communities, and they were the ones to start bringing that forward. And like most things that start in Black or people of color's communities, it gets mainstreamed and whitewashed, and unfortunately that's where it ends up. So now we have things like Dove doing body acceptance and stuff, but it unfortunately starts to come with, again, the personal responsibility instead of a systemic and cultural change, and the idea that you can buy your way there. So with fat liberation, it is not so much a cultural thing as it is a issue of looking at systemic issues. So what kind of policies are we enacting? What kind of social norms are we creating? So it kind of, I think personally, and I know I'm limited in my experience in education, but personally, I think that HAES and fat acceptance are much more about the individual and the personal inside, like individual work, whereas fat liberation and body liberation is more of a, what are we doing going forward? How do we take down the institutionalized systems that keep this happening?
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. And I've seen that again kind of from the outside, but just that Hayes is a very, like you said, commercialized, capitalist, very beautiful, prim and proper, at least from what I've seen. And I'm like, that's all well and good, but like, I don't want to just see conventionally beautiful, dressed up, maked up fat people, right? Like I want to see more of a variety because I'm not a model. But if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mic and stop and give space.
While people are writing questions, if they would like to, no pressure, guys. But there is absolutely, I think when you're talking about the commercialized stuff, as a higher weight fat person, I still struggle with an extra level of oppression because there is now, as we talked about, because of the capitalism and because of the media and stuff, there is the pretty fat, the fat, but in the socially acceptable, your fat is in just the right places. And, maybe you're not too far away from what's considered socially acceptable. So there is a lot of pushback still within the fat liberation community and body liberation communities to take away the whitewashing, to take away the ableism, and to really make this into truly, like, the word liberation is very different from the word acceptance, like it's not so much that I want people to think, oh my God, she's gorgeous. I want people to think, wow, she deserves basic human rights and medical care. And there is still a lot of hierarchical, classist, racist thinking that happens within some of the more socialized movements, as far as like, trying to make clothing accessible, or trying to make medical aids and like my walker and things accessible for more than just the people who are going to buy it. Sorry, I got distracted to read.
No. Do you want me to read the question in the chat for you?
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, so it's from Kat. It says, first of all, thank you for sharing your story. As someone with little heart emoji, as someone who has been called fat most of their life, what are some self-affirmations that you tell yourself? I struggle accepting how my body is.
Ooh, good question, Kat. So I have found the most effective thing for me was to change, like deliberately change what I was consuming as far as media goes. So I have made a very specific and diligent attempts to bring in more creators who are on the higher end of the fat spectrum, creators who have a wider range of disabilities than what is considered socially acceptable, to really change, like, what am I watching on TikTok? What am I watching on Reels? Who am I looking at on Instagram? Because as I was talking about earlier, as far as personal responsibility, affirmations are wonderful and they can be very helpful. But if you're constantly surrounded by things that don't match up with those internalized affirmations, it kind of just unroots them for me in my experience, right? So, if I'm like, okay, this is my body, I'm fat, this is the way I exist, I look like my grandmother. My cousin just reminded me yesterday how much I look like my grandmother and my aunt. And if I'm not seeing those people around me and hearing those affirmations applied to them and by them, it's just so hard to try and build a foundation that allows you to believe those internalized affirmations, right? So if I'm telling myself, yes, I am fat, but everything that I see around me says that fatness is bad, it's going to be really hard to have that internalized feeling. I think a lot of times we get the message of no one's going to love you until you love yourself. I think that's just terrible. What I think is that we learn to love ourselves when we see it happening around us. So take time and use those labels: disabled, fat liberation, body liberation. Look for the tags on Instagram, and then kind of start building and following from there. If you can find, there's some really wonderful like fat Black creators that I follow on Instagram. Other disabled people that are talking about it. And just when you start hearing it, it just is so much easier to believe it on the inside.
Yeah, I'm actually going to second that like a lot, like 200, 300%, because for me, sorry, I don't know if you can hear, there's a car going by. One of the things that I was trying to tell myself, trying to affirm myself in, was I am allowed to take up space. I am allowed to have a voice. And I couldn't hear that until I was seeing people like me on media taking up space, using their voices as well. So yeah, second that quite a bit. Any other questions or comments, chats, etc.?
I actually did, and I also wanted to mention that if anyone has a question that they would like read privately, you're welcome to message Azalea or I, and we can read it without using your name. Sorry, that's the usual disclaimer I forgot to give. But my question to you, and you've talked about this a little bit, as a big question we get at DREAM as a disability organization is from students usually, of how do we advocate for ourselves? And I know you mentioned bringing your partner to doctor's appointments and things like that, but I was just wondering if you had any other maybe advice for self-advocacy.
Yes. So particularly around disability, what I have found, if you don't have a partner, you can bring a friend, bring a parent. What I have found is that vocabulary makes a big difference, especially when I'm dealing with people who are considered to be authoritative or are somehow more experienced or more established than I am. I am able to use some of these labels to give a foundation to what I'm talking about. So, for example, if I go into a doctor and I am using the words like fat and disabled, I find that they will tend to meet me more on the level of less like paternalizing and more of like, okay, this person understands what they're talking. Sorry, his little tongue's probably dry. um, uh, they will stop talking to me like I am a child. And so not only does finding that vocabulary make it easier to find the resources that you need, but it helps to also get other people to engage with you in the level of vocabulary that you are using. So when I tell someone I'm disabled, when I tell someone that I'm homebound, when I tell someone, you know, that I have multiple chronic illnesses, or then I find that they're not like, oh, that's so cute, you know, like the oh goodness, well, that's sweet of you to mention, kind of like we do to kids, where, you know, they're like, they say something and we're like, oh, that's adorable. You don't know what you're talking about, but that's really cute. I find that having that vocabulary helps people to take it seriously. And if they're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, I find people more willing to ask, really, to say, like, I've never heard somebody use those words. Why are you doing that? You know, like, they might even be a little offended at first. Like, why did you say that you're fat? Like, because they have heard themselves called that in a derogatory way. And it really opens up a moment for conversation where you could say, and this, you don't have to, obviously, like, this is more of like, if you're in the place to, if you would like to, it's like that little bitty baby step of advocacy work to say, I use this because, can I give you a reference for why I use this word? Can I tell you, like, here's a website that explains why I am using this word in this way? And it really kind of gives you that opportunity to say, there's a reason people don't use this, and it's shaming. Like, we should embrace that, and we should use the words that are descriptors without that judgment and that shame that goes behind it. Like, if you don't say disabled, then you start feeling like, I like, if I'm disabled and I can't say the word, what does that say about me? Does that help with that question?
No, I think that's great. And I count myself among one of those folks who didn't. I talk about this often, but I had a 504 plan all throughout school. I had K through 12, well, not K through 12, but fifth through 12. I had accommodations, but I really didn't think of myself as disabled until I got into college and really learned what that meant. And I do think in part that's because everyone around me was so scared to use that word. And my parents were worried about what that meant and all that. So no, I think that was great. And something, I don't want to put you on the spot, but something in reference to what you said before, if you have recommendations of any creators, maybe you can send us a couple ideas, and we can post those on Instagram and get them a little more views and get us a wider.
I would be very happy to do that. I can put together a list of some of the people and stuff that I started following to try and just normalize the experience that you have in life, and just to go like, oh, I'm not the only one. And on top of that, to kind of just crack that shell a little bit and be like, oh, I never thought of it that way. So yes, I would absolutely be delighted to give you a list of creators and content that I think is a great place to start, and you can start branching out from there.
That would be amazing. I personally find it a little overwhelming to find creators. Like, I'm always like, yeah, like I want to follow a wide diversity, and then you get lost in the hashtags. And so I appreciate recommendations for sure.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yes.
And with that, if anyone doesn't have any other questions, Azalea, do you want to hop into the end? I'll resume my screen share here.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you make it full screen? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, so we just wanted to end with a few resources, and one of them has already been posted, the First Do No Harm blog that's in the chat. The other one is Junk Food Science blog. Carol, do you want to say anything more about that?
Junk Food Science was one of the first places that I started reading to really challenge my understanding of the science, right? Because we're, to some extent, I'm sure this is a little debated after COVID and everything, we place a lot of value in science and the studies that are quoted to us in mainstream media. And Junk Food Science, the blog is archived right now. They're not updating, but there is a tremendous amount of resources where the person that was running it really went in and provided links for the studies that were done and talks about the ways in which mainstream media and stuff just kind of warped it for their own monetary gain, where they'll say like, oh, this study says that 400,000 people die a year from being overweight, and it's just blatantly false. That's not what the study said. So Junk Food Science, they have a really fantastic series called The Obesity Paradox, and where they specifically talk about the ways in which a lot of the research that says that, fatness and being overweight is going to cause health problems or shorten your life and whatnot. And not only did they find a lot of it wasn't true, but they actually found it was the opposite. There are cases where having more weight might improve your chances of surviving or living longer. And just kind of breaking down, it's not necessarily the idea that, fatness can be healthy, because health is not, it should not be a paramount thing. Like, we do not want to disvalue people because they are not healthy. But what this does with this information is to kind of help take down that barrier of being like, well, they're scientists, they know what they're talking about. And the scientists do, the mainstream media and journalists may not. They have some reason to report it in the way that they're reporting it. So I really think Junk Food Science is an excellent place to start for like a 99 to 101 level introduction to what have you been taught about fatness and what is actually true on a scientific level.
That's great. The other thing that I was thinking about, there's I'll put it, actually, when you send out your list of creators, I will add, actually, maybe we can make it like a live document so that anyone or some specific people can add resources. That's a thought. Because I was gonna say, I have a couple that I was thinking of, one in particular, and I can't think of the name of the website, but it's a blog post that says, like, the title of the post is what food is bad, or something like that. What food is bad for you? And then the body of the post is just like, none of it. If it's poison, it's bad.
Is that the fat nutritionist?
I think it is, actually,
Michelle
now that I think
Allison.
about it. Yeah.
She's
yeah.
phenomenal. I worked with her for my recovery from the eating disorder. Her blog is amazing. And yeah, like my favorite thing from hers is that there's 2 rules for nutrition: eat or die. And the second one is there's no other rules. So, there's a lot that we can do when we have the words that it takes to find these resources, because they're not exactly something that you're going to see posted on MSN or CNN or mainstream outlets like that. So when I start talking about fatness, when I talk about liberation, when I talk about disability, there's reasons to use those words specifically so that you can get people to the resources that are necessary to kind of challenge those cultural norms.
Absolutely. Well, this has been amazing. I don't know if anyone has any final thoughts or closing thoughts or comments. We have about a minute and a half. I know that's super specific. I don't want to take up people's time more than we have allotted, especially Carol. But thank you. Well, hold on, I'll pause. Does anyone have anything? Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Carol. I can speak for myself that this was incredible to hear your stories and hear the resources and the ideas. And I hope the same was true for everyone else as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me and giving a platform to discuss some of these issues.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.